In today's video, we're talking about the 10 most yarn-hungry stitch patterns and how to tell just by looking at a stitch pattern whether or not it's going to be a yarn guzzler. So if that sounds like just your cozy cup of tea, get comfortable and let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Midweek Ramble. My name is Taylor, and I will be your host. Today's video comes to you thanks to a lovely viewer who left a tip over at the Wool Needles Hands tip line at the Wool Needles Hands website. This was such an interesting question, and it relates to how much yarn a particular stitch pattern uses when compared to stockinette stitch. And there was an additional question asked in this tip line submission about how to tell just by looking at a stitch pattern how much yarn it's going to consume as compared to stockinette stitch. And what are some key things that you can look for in a stitch pattern that may suggest that it's going to be a yarn guzzler. And I don't know why I really don't like that term, but that's what we're gonna go with for today's video. So here is the tip line submission that I received. It says, "Hi Taylor, you mentioned on your latest podcast not being able to use a particular ribbing because it uses 20% more yarn than stockinette." And the podcast that he's referring to here, I was actually talking about fisherman's rib using 20% more yarn. And I think it's actually more than that on average than stockinette stitch. And it was a whole question about whether I'd be able to use that yarn or not for a project. I'm facing a similar dilemma of not being able to use a texture I wanted and having to frog because I didn't realize just how much yarn said texture would use. I would love to see a video exploring what types of stitch patterns use up a ton of yarn and which don't. If I'm looking at two different stitch patterns, is there any way to estimate which will use more yarn than the other? If I want to modify a pattern to use a different texture, is there a good way to estimate how much more or how much less yarn I will likely need? Now, these are great questions, and I'm going to answer as much of this as I can today. I've done some research. I don't have all of these answers from pure experience alone, but I've done my homework, I've done some research, and I think what I have to share with you today will be an eye-opener. Okay, the first thing I want to do here is share the top 10 most yarn-hungry stitch patterns as it compares to stockinette stitch. Coming in at number 10 is moss stitch. This is a slightly different pattern to seed stitch, and it creates a really lovely, even and consistent textured fabric. Moss stitch uses roughly 10 to 25% more yarn than stockinette stitch. Number 9 is seed stitch, which is very similar to moss stitch, and it also uses roughly 10 to 25% more yarn than stockinette stitch. Now, number 8 is not really a stitch pattern as much as it is a knitting technique. However, it does create a very unique texture across the fabric, and that is cable knitting. This creates intricate and very dense designs with lots of overlapping stitches and sometimes incorporates other textures such as seed stitch or garter stitch in and amongst the cables. For these and other reasons, cable knitting uses roughly 20 to 40% more yarn than stockinette stitch. Okay, this one is number 7. I feel like it could have been number 8 and swapped places with cable knitting, but this is garter stitch. Garter stitch is the fabric that you get when you knit every single row, and it looks like this. It's a very all over even and consistent textured stitch pattern, and this uses between 25 and 35% more yarn than stockinette stitch. Coming in at number 6 is basket weave stitch patterns, anything that incorporates stitch patterns where you have a basket weave texture. This highly textured and overlapping fabric uses between 25 and 50% more yarn on average than stockinette stitch, and that is a very big range, so it really can depend there. Number 5 is linen stitch. Linen stitch creates a very dense and woven fabric. All of the stitches are packed really close together. There's not a lot of air coming through that fabric, and that's why it uses a lot more yarn than stockinette stitch. 30 to 50% more yarn to be approximate. Hello, lovely people. Taylor from the future here. I left out a stitch pattern, so you will notice that my numbering is off. I left out number 4, which is honeycomb stitch. Honeycomb stitch uses anywhere from 30 to 50% more yarn than stockinette stitch. Number 5 is fisherman's rib, and that was the texture I was actually referring to when that inspired this question to begin with. Fisherman's rib is very similar to brioche, and it creates really lovely open and airy ribs that are fluffy and pillowy and squishy squishy, and I love it so much. And this uses anywhere between 35 and 40% more yarn than stockinette stitch. Coming in at number 2 is brioche stitch. And this is very similar to fisherman's rib, but there's a little bit more going on there, and there's a little bit more of a density to this fabric than fisherman's rib. And for that reason, it uses a little bit more yarn than fisherman's rib does, as that compares to stockinette stitch. Brioche knitting uses about 50 to sometimes 100% more yarn, and I think the 100% is on the rare side than stockinette stitch in general. And then topping that list as the most yarn hungry stitch pattern or knitting technique, and you may have been able to guess this one, and that is double knitting. This is a reversible fabric. You can flip it over and you get the same thing on both sides, because you are creating essentially 2 layers of fabric attached to one another. This uses on average twice as much yarn as you would need to create stockinette stitch fabric. Now, these are only some stitch patterns. These are some that are really common. You see these used a lot in different knitting patterns and employed in different areas and different places to create different styles and aesthetics. There are lots more in terms of stitch patterns out there. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, just a top 10 of the most yarn hungry stitch patterns as that relates to stockinette stitch. But let's say you are looking at a book with lots of different stitch patterns therein, and you would like to decide just by looks alone which stitch patterns are likely to use the most yarn, or which stitch patterns are likely to use the least amount of yarn. Here are a few key things to keep in mind when deciding if a stitch pattern is going to be yarn hungry or if a stitch pattern is going to be yarn light. The first thing is pay attention to the texture and thickness of that stitch pattern. Now, if you don't have a swatch in your hands, it's kind of hard to determine the thickness, but we are pretty good at determining the squishiness of a fabric by looking. We do it all the time when we see people's knits on social media or here on YouTube. We can kind of tell if there's a lot of air going on and a lot of thickness to a particular fabric. Pay attention to that. Patterns that produce a thick textured fabric will typically require more yarn. Really great examples of this are brioche and fisherman's rib. The fabric itself is lofty and airy, but it's also very thick and squishy, and it uses lots of yarn to create that effect. The next thing you're going to want to pay attention to is stitch density. I mentioned earlier linen stitch being comprised of really tightly woven stitches, and that tight weave and dense fabric is created from lots of stitches packed really close together. When you pack all of your stitches really close together, you fit more stitches into a space, and the more stitches you can fit into a space, the more yarn you're going to have to use to create a space. So anything that's very dense and tightly packed, or any kind of a stitch pattern that is described by a woven texture, it's going to require a lot of yarn because you have a lot of density and a lot of closely packed stitches. Another thing to consider is whether or not in a stitch pattern you see a lot of layering and overlapping of stitches. Entrelace designs, and I think that's how you pronounce that. I've only ever really read that word and not often heard somebody speak that word. Patterns that incorporate that entrelace motif, cables, anything where you have a lot of overlapping stitches, meaning that stitches are going to be trading places with other stitches and requiring they're almost going to be serving a double purpose. That means you're going to need more stitches and more yarn to create a space. So you're going to require more yarn for anything that has a lot of overlapping and doubling and multiple layers of stitches, like cables and entrelace. And the last one, which I kind of feel is a no-brainer when you think about it, but if you're not thinking about it, it might escape you, is the reversibility of a project. If the project is completely reversible, meaning that you have 2 layers of fabric, similar to what you would get if you're doing like a color work motif or if you're doing double knitting, you're going to require a lot more yarn. And in fact, I didn't actually mention color work here because I don't really consider that a stitch pattern, but that's something really important to understand is anytime you're doing color work, that area where you are working the color work is going to require a lot more yarn because you're carrying the multiple colors under the project. So something to consider. But reversibility and multiple layers, as mentioned with the previous one, is going to be an indicator of a yarn hungry stitch pattern. Well, I hope that answered that question. It was really eye-opening for me learning all the different percentages, which are approximate and rough, and I'll drop some sources down below for you for places where I found some of this information if you want to learn a little bit more about that. But it's interesting and it's important to kind of have that information in your back pocket if you're looking to design your own project or your own garment or whatever, and you want to come up with a stitch pattern that's going to work for you, because if you want something that's going to use less yarn, you want to stay away from some of these more yarn hungry stitch patterns. So I hope that answered your question. That was a lot of fun. I learned something from this. So thank you to the person who submitted that question. And if you would like to submit questions for future midweek ramble topics, definitely do so over at the Wool Needles Hands tip line at woolneedleshands.com. And if you would like to further support the work that I'm doing here at the Wool Needles Hands channel, or you would like to see some additional content, don't forget to head over to Patreon. You can become an all access patron over there, or if you're simply just visiting and you want to see what's available over there for folks just visiting the Patreon, you can hang around and see what content is available for free followers over there as well. Thank you so much for any support that you're able to provide. It keeps the lights on here at Wool Needles Hands, and it means so much to me. Until we meet again on the next episode of the podcast, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.